Greetings all, Chieftain here, Nicholas Moran. With the release of Graf Spee for High School Fleet in the game, we thought, well, why not go over for this talk to the big grey floaty things? The German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee is famous for several reasons. Well, firstly, she was an elegant and powerful ship in her own right. Secondly, she fought well. And thirdly, it was one of the few concrete victories that the British could point to at the beginning of the war. So it is understandable that the Battle of the River Plate was as hyped as it was. The background of the ship herself we don't really need to go over. She's quite famous and all the specifications and so on are easily available online, or in the game. Suffice to say, she was armoured to protect against 8-inch shells, diesel-powered, which meant less smoke, and had good range, 2 triple 11-inch turrets. Built to the 10,000-ton limit of Versailles, which coincidentally also matched the 10,000-ton limit of the Washington Treaty, she displaced a little more than that. You would think it would be rather easy to design a ship to keep within a set displacement, but as the Japanese and Americans also demonstrated, it's easier said than done, even with the best intentions. In any case, instruction number 1 of the German High Command stated, "The German Navy will conduct mercantile warfare having England as its principal target." The ship was designed for purpose. In a nutshell, fast enough to outrun anything which can outgun her. Bit like a battlecruiser, smaller scale. She left Wilhelmshaven under the command of Captain Langsdorff on the 23rd of August 1939, just before the war started. It was over a month, however, 26th of September, before she was granted permission to engage the enemy's ships. Until then, after the rapid defeat of Poland, Hitler was still hoping for some form of peace with the British and French, and wished to avoid antagonizing them. Her instructions were also very clear to avoid the risk of a full naval battle. By this stage, Graf Spee was in a waiting area in the South Atlantic. Her supply ship, Altmark, was nearby, having recently filled her tanks in Texas. Her target was going to be the merchant vessels going from the South American area across the South Atlantic. The Brazilian area of Pernambuco was the point in South America most easterly, and it made a reasonable refueling point for merchants. So, off in that direction she went, to the area patrolled by what the British called Force Y, which interestingly contained the cruiser Neptune and the French battleship Strasbourg, which was a vessel specifically designed to counter the Deutschland-class ships. Langsdorff was not to know of this, of course. The afternoon of the 30th saw Graf Spee find its first victim, SS Clement, a 5,000-ton ship able to make all of 13 knots. The German raider launched its float plane, which flew to Clement, and ordered it to stop, but not before the radio operator sent out a distress call and they destroyed any classified materials. Ordering the crew to take to the boats, the chief engineer and captain were kept on board Graf Spee. Given the correct course for the nearby port of Maceo, the crew were set free. Langsdorff also radioed Pernambuco that the crew were afloat. They made port the next day. In the meantime, 2 prisoners were interrogated, and it was discovered that the British merchant ships had been instructed to keep transmitting distress calls even when ordered by the approaching enemy ships not to do so. A neutral ship passed by, Greek one. She was flagged down, and the 2 British prisoners, who really weren't feeling all that well, were passed on to her. Once this was achieved, Graf Spee went somewhere else, quickly. Given the instructions to continue to radio information, Langsdorff felt he had to come up with a way of getting closer to its victims before they realized that they were being intercepted. The solution was to repaint the control tower in a very light grey and then run dark grey, or black, down the corners. The idea was to simulate a tripod mast. Another thing they did was they created a fake B turret and a second funnel. This proved to be very successful, given that her next victim, Newton Beach, didn't realize that Graf Spee was not a French warship until the German got to within a mile and ordered her to heave to. Newton Beach, 4,500 tons, was carrying some 7,000 tons of maize. A brief SOS was transmitted, instead of RRRR for radar, and the ship was taken before all the classified documents could be destroyed. This informed the German captain that no shipping or convoy routes had yet been set up, so ships were basically sailing on their own, and so easy prey, if they could be found. Even better results were seen when Graf Spee came across Ashley, a 4,200 tonner captured before they had the opportunity to even send out a signal. Newton Beach was being kept as a prize ship, so Ashley's crew was transferred over, some of the provisions were appropriated, and she was sent to the bottom. Newton Beach, however, was just a little bit too slow for Langsdorff's liking, so he transferred everybody aboard Graf Spee and sank her too. The next victim was SS Huntsman. At 8,000 tons, the crew of 84 was a little bit too much to bring aboard Graf Spee, so instead a prize crew was sent aboard her, and then the ship sent to meet up with Altmark, along with her cargo of ore, tea, leather, wool, and rubber. These last three captures were in the area north of St. Helena and east of Ascension, making a pretty obvious X as to where Graf Spee was located. Langsdorff decided it was probably bringing a little heat upon himself and it would be a good time to be somewhere else. He sent a fake signal from Newton Beach, claiming to have been torpedoed by a U-boat, and then he went off to meet Altmark himself. On the morning of 14th of October, the captain of Altmark found himself being intercepted by a French heavy cruiser, only to have his heart attack stopped when Graf Spee finally identified herself. The fake tripod had worked yet again. The prisoners were transferred to Altmark from Huntsman, along with assorted captured supplies and some creature comforts to make the prisoners a little bit more comfortable. In interviews later, every captured British seaman stated that Langsdorff treated them honourably and well, although conditions under Captain Dow on Altmark and the guards posted from Graf Spee under Lieutenant Schmidt were somewhat less genial. As this happened over a 3-day period, Langsdorff also took advantage of the respite to overhaul his ship's engines. And we'll be coming back to that again as a repeating story. Finally, with all transfers complete, Huntsman was sent to the bottom on the 17th. Given now that the British were starting to lose ships on the Trans-South Atlantic run, Langsdorff then decided to move south for two reasons. Firstly, because of the threat of the Royal and French navies, which were estimated to be coming against him in force, and secondly, because British ships may have started being rerouted along the Cape of Good Hope instead of through the Mediterranean. As the ship started moving south, aerial recon from the seaplane sighted Travanian, 5,300 tons and loaded with zinc from Australia. Again, Graf Spee closed in under a French flag with the fake tripod mast to about 2 miles away before hauling up the German ensign. Despite machine gun fire, Travanian's wireless operator continued to send a distress call until the radio apparatus was destroyed by the firing. Unfortunately, despite his courage, the evidently unnerved operator managed to miss a few minor details in his transmission, such as the name of his ship or his current location. Travanian met the same fate as the other ships. Next morning, British Naval's base at Simonstown, South Africa asked any ships who may have heard the transmission to send it back again. 2 ships replied, each with different locations for the distress call, and neither was the correct original location. However, by bizarre coincidence, one of the 2 ships replied with the position that Graf Spee just happened to be in at that moment in time. So, Langsdorff headed west at best possible speed, while the British decided to call in Force L, which was Battleship Renown and aircraft carrier Furious, as well as Force Y, the aforementioned Strasbourg and Neptune, to help with the South African-based Force H, cruisers Sussex and Shropshire. At about 10 p.m. that night, Graf Spee passed nearby a large, blacked-out ship moving at high speed. Concluding it was probably a passenger cargo liner, the bridge officers decided it would be too hard to judge fall of shot at night, and it was not worth engaging. The cruiser decided to give it some space, kept hidden, and so she turned away. The gunnery officers, though, swore that their optics were filled with the silhouette of an aircraft carrier. After another refueling with Altmark on the 28th, Langsdorff decided to go around South Africa and pay a visit to the Indian Ocean. Firstly, to be somewhere other than where the British and French forces were looking in the Atlantic, and secondly, to give the impression that the ship was only just getting started. In reality, though, the cruiser's engines were starting to be in need of some serious work, and Langsdorff's thoughts were really more heading towards making home port for repair. She passed the Cape of Good Hope on 3rd of November, but bad weather put something of a crimp in her raiding plans. It wasn't until the afternoon of the 15th that she found a new target for her attentions, the brand new and rather small tanker Africa Shell, all of 700 tons. Only 7 miles from the coast, the crew were sent on their merry way, but the master was detained aboard Graf Spee as the ship was sunk. A neutral steamer, Tihuku Maru, was sighted, so Graf Spee went off to the northeast out of sight before turning around. The next day, a ship flying the Dutch flag was stopped and inspected, but there was no doubt it really was a Dutch vessel, which was neutral at the time, so she also was let on her way. By this point, intercepted radio traffic is indicating that the British had copped on to the fact that a German radio was now operating in the Indian Ocean, and since the pickings were seemingly rather slim where he was, Langsdorff decided he's achieved his decoy purpose and that he'd go back to the Atlantic. Probably good timing. The British sent forces H and K to picket the Cape of Good Hope, but they got there too late to intercept the German ship, which was by then meeting with Altmark again in the middle of the South Atlantic. Langsdorff estimated that the ship was provisioned until the end of February, but the ability to continue to chase merchantmen would depend entirely on the length of time that the engines could hold out. He also repeatedly requested permission from HQ to at least assume some risk to his ship, otherwise he would be doomed to randomly roam the seas picking up what scraps happened to come his way, instead of being more efficient with his time. However, given that he had decided that a return home was in the near future regardless, any combat damage was not so much of a worry. That could be repaired in port at the same time as the engines would be. Over 2 weeks after the last time a ship disappeared, on the 2nd of December, Graf Spee struck again. After sending its float plane off in one direction, the ship spotted the smoke in the other. That ship turned out to be the 10,000-tonner Doric Star, carrying meat, dairy, and wool. The first notification that she was in trouble was the impact of a shell into the water a couple of 100 yards off the bow. Although she was a fine prize, the engines had been disabled by the engineer, and the wireless operator had continued to signal the attack, so Langsdorff could not hang around. Besides, they'd lost radio communication with the float plane for some reason, so the ship needed to go find it. Landing in rough seas without the ship to create some calm water, the airplane, which it turned out had damaged radio batteries for the receiver, damaged a float and started taking on water. Transmitting for help and then finally sending up signal flares, Graf Spee found her missing airplane and arrived just in time to save both man and machine. A little less drama the next day when Tyroa was encountered. Another ship going from Australia to England with meat, wool, and lead, coming in at some 8,000 tons. She refused to stop transmitting despite taking fire. Unfortunately for Langsdorff, who rather wanted to keep the ship as a prize, the firing had damaged her steering gear. So down to the bottom she went as well, minus the 81 prisoners transferred. Another rendezvous with Altmark on 6th of December for fuel replenishment and prisoner transfer. Plus a little searchlight practice against Altmark, as Langsdorff thought the crews might be getting a little bit rusty. It would appear that at this time the French fake tripod was painted over with normal camouflage. 7th of December, Stronschal, a 4,000-tonner going from Montevideo to England with wheat, was stopped and sunk. The captain did have enough time to throw the secret document bags overboard, but he must not have put in enough weight because the German sailors managed to recover one of them. In the documents was mention of the use of assembly points for shipping in the River Plate area, plus notification that a convoy of 4 ships escorted by an auxiliary cruiser was about to leave Montevideo. This seemed to Langsdorff like pretty good pickings. So off to the River Plate he went. In the meantime, a Commodore Harwood in command of the South America Division, aka Force G, was considering his options. His force of 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers was based in the Falkland Islands off the southern tip of Argentina, but he had an area some 2,000 miles long to cover. It was worth considering that the 8th of December 1939 was the 25th anniversary of the Battle of the Falkland Islands, where a German squadron under the command of a naval officer by the name of Graf Spee had a rather unfortunate encounter with the Royal Navy. The possibility existed that the ship named for him, which just happened to be in the area, might decide to try to even the score by attacking the supply base at Port Stanley on that date. Thus, Harwood's 2 heavy cruisers, Exeter and Cumberland, were to be found in the South Atlantic. When the day passed with no sign of the German ship, Cumberland put into Stanley for a much-needed overhaul. Exeter went up north to meet with the other 2 ships in the division, HMS's Ajax and Achilles. Taking a stab at the problem, Harwood decided to head for the River Plate. In the perhaps unfortunate event that his ships actually encountered Graf Spee, his standing orders were attack at once, day or night. That said, he really didn't expect to be in the same place as the German raider when he got to the River Plate, and he believed that his first warning was going to be that the enemy was around from a distress call from another victim. As a result, he didn't send up a scout plane. On the other hand, the Germans had spotted the masts of the British ships, and believing them to be the convoy, turned to engage. She increased speed with the intent of closing the range before the enemy could build up steam to increase their speed. Aboard Graf Spee, the British prisoners were generally left to their own devices. They were quartered underneath one of the main gun turrets. At the time the ship went into action, a couple were getting exercise on deck, and in the frenzy of preparation for combat, they asked a German officer what was going on. The response was, "We were expecting an attack, and I admire the courage of men who had planned to attack Graf Spee with such a little ship." Another German officer swung by the prisoners' quarters and notified them, "I'm afraid we're going to have to leave you to your own devices for a while." This increase of speed, however, caused the normally clean-running cruiser to emit a cloud of dense smoke from the diesel exhaust. This was sighted by the British. Howard believed it was a British ship, so sent Exeter to go up and investigate and meet it. As the two ships headed straight for each other, Graf Spee came into view of the two light cruisers, and at 0616 came the signal from Exeter, "I think it is a pocket battleship," followed immediately by "Enemy in sight, bearing 322 degrees. This did not allow very much time for reaction, however. Graf Spee opened fire upon Exeter at 0617. By this point, Langsdorff had identified his enemy but believed it would be impossible to shake off three cruisers. The solution at this point was just to sink them, which, in fairness, the ship was reasonably well equipped to do. The British aboard Graf Spee had rather mixed feelings. On one hand, they hoped that the Royal Navy would win. On the other hand, they took some exception to the idea of being aboard a ship about to get shot at and sunk. The third salvo from Graf Spee, 0623, straddled Exeter, the near miss killing the starboard torpedo crew and starting fires. It also knocked out some of the centralized gunnery systems. The next salvo saw a shell pass through the ship without exploding. This must have been evident to the German gunnery crews, as they then changed their fusing from base fuse to impact. British gunnery wasn't much worse. Exeter's third salvo also straddled the German, but the German gun crews demonstrated their displeasure at this by landing an 11-inch shell on Exeter's B turret with her 8th salvo. Exeter's B turret demonstrated its own displeasure at this turn of events by losing its front half and 8 men within. In the meantime, splinters wrecked the wheelhouse, leaving only 3 officers alive and wounding the captain. The other 2 turrets continued in operation, scoring a hit somewhere aft of Graf Spee's funnel. It took some minutes for Exeter to come back under control, with Captain Bell conning from an aft position and using messengers and a boat compass to do it. 2 more 11-inch shells started flooding in the forward part of the ship, and Exeter was smoking heavily, albeit still in the fight. In the meantime, the 2 light cruisers had entered the fray, not achieving much due to the extended range. Graf Spee's secondary batteries, which at 5.9 inches about matched the light cruiser's main armament of 6 inches, responded. What they were doing, though, was approaching off the German's port bow. Seeing that Exeter was not doing too well, Langsdorff decided that he had now more pressing problems and turned away from the light cruisers in order to present a less tempting torpedo target, and then he trained the 11-inch guns on Ajax. Just before the German turned, Exeter's torpedo officer on his own initiative sent off a salvo towards Graf Spee. The turn made this fruitless, but Captain Bell decided that the idea had some merit, so turned to starboard to bring his portside torpedo mount to bear. With Exeter now turning towards the German again and apparently laying a smokescreen, she wasn't, it just looked that way from the fires, Langsdorff decided he may have erred in switching his attention to Ajax, so the main gunners again reset for a new engagement on Exeter. German gunners were evidently not bad at all, hitting Exeter again in the navigating officer's cabin, killed 5 radiomen, and then knocked out the starboard 4-inch gun. This was now 0639. The next German salvo landed on the A turret, which responded pretty much as the B turret did. If that wasn't enough, immediately afterwards, the Germans tended to fire one turret, spot fall a shot, and then fire the other turret. Another 11-inch round burst inside the ship, creating splinter holes below the waterline and starting fire above the 4-inch magazine. This was actually the most damaging hit of the lot, though, as it also killed off a good portion of the ship's electrical systems, including to the gunfire transmitting station. The final turret was still in the fight under local control. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Jennings, was standing on top of the turret and shouting corrections down the hatch. By now, Exeter had shipped 650 tons of water, was listing 7 to 10 degrees, and was down 3 feet at the bow, out of communication, almost out of gun turrets, down to 1 4-inch mount, out of power, had lost the bridge, gun directors, and had multiple fires burning. 2 of them were major ones. But the only thing still working was the propulsion system. Graf Spee turned his attention back to Ajax and Achilles, which were close in the distance, helped by the German zigzagging. In the pause, Ajax had launched a Sea Fox spotting aircraft. A near miss on Achilles knocked out Captain Parry, wounding him in both legs, and the director control tower, which took Achilles out of the fight for a few minutes until everybody regained consciousness, and then applied a bit of first aid. Some 40 minutes into the battle, Graf Spee started to exit to the northwest at 24 knots, making smoke. The British light cruisers were doing the best of 30 knots, with Exeter trying as best it could to keep up, firing away with its 1 remaining turret. Captain Bell was hoping to be able to get close enough to ram the German. Perhaps Langsdorff needed a few minutes to think things through. He had been lightly wounded himself by splinters and then knocked unconscious. The German guns were again trained towards Exeter. British gunnery then took a significant turn for the worse. It turned out that the airplane's radio was tuned to the wrong frequency and the gunnery officer wasn't listening in on it. That took a little bit of time to rectify. And then, with Achilles' gun director and radios hit, she was firing independently from Ajax, but the spotter and Ajax's gunnery crew confused the fire from the 2 ships, and Ajax corrected off of the reports from Achilles' gunfire. This took a little bit of a while to sort out. In the meantime, since the range was a bit long for the light cruisers anyway, Commodore Harwood decided not to worry about bringing the aft turrets to bear, and instead just closed on Graf Spee at best speed. The new threat did not go unnoticed by Langsdorff, who yet again retrained his guns onto a new target. The level of attention was demonstrated by Graf Spee quickly doing 2 130-degree turns to avoid Ajax's torpedo salvo fired at 9,000 yards at 7:23. Both Harwood and Langsdorff were considered to know what they were on about with regards to torpedoes, and Langsdorff from that point on made sure to present the worst possible torpedo target to the 2 light cruisers. At this point, a solid 11-inch hit knocked out both of Ajax's rear turrets from the fight, followed promptly by a torpedo launch from Graf Spee, but this was seen by the Sea Fox and the British ships easily avoided them. The range continued to close. At 4 miles and at 0738, the British 6-inch fire was being responded to with 11-inch primaries, 5.9-inch secondaries, and 4.1-inch AA guns. Obviously metric, but I'm keeping it simple for the American audience here, which were on the German ship. The British were scoring hits, but in Harwood's opinion, they were having the same effect as a lot of bloody snowballs. Oh, and to add insult to injury, Hoist and Ajax's B turret failed, leaving her with just 1 properly operating turret. Not that it mattered much. He was told that Ajax, and presumably Achilles, only had enough ammunition left for about 50 broadsides. It turned out that Achilles alone had fired over 1,200 rounds of 6-inch. Worst of all, an 11-inch shell had exploded in his cabin, destroying his golf clubs. It was too much for Harwood. By this point, Exeter's flooding had cut the power to her last turret, and being effectively unarmed, Harwood sent her back to Port Stanley. The 2 lesser ships were also a little bit peppered, with Achilles almost out of ammo, but generally functional, and Ajax almost down to the level of providing moral support only. On the other hand, Graf Spee, as near as he could tell, was still firing accurately with all guns, making good speed, and seemed to generally be intact. The direct daylight approach obviously wasn't working, so he'd fall back to shadow and try his luck at night. As the ships turned away, a parting gift from Graf Spee saw to the toppling of Ajax's topmast, along with the wireless aerials. Captain Langsdorff took advantage of this little bit of a lull to do an assessment of the ship. His conclusions were later sent to Berlin as follows. Inspection of direct hits reveals that all galleys except for the Admiral's galley have been badly damaged. Water entering flour store endangers bread supply, while a direct hit on the forecastle makes the ship unseaworthy for the North Atlantic in winter. This led him to conclude that going to Montevideo was the best course of action, even at the risk of being shut in. Now, this decision has been questioned for the decades ever since. Langsdorff's crew had taken 37 dead and 57 wounded. A rangefinder had been knocked out, 2 secondary guns, and of the 17 hits Graf Spee had taken, quote, 3 of them bounced off the armor like turnips. The rest did limited damage. The hull had 9 holes, most of them were under 6 inches across. The one in the bow was closer to 6 feet in diameter. As the ship shadowed west, Achilles got a little bit too close, and at 10:10, at 23,000 yards, 3 11-inch salvos reminded her to keep her distance. The next thing that happened, just after 11 a.m., was that the British vessel Shakespeare wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Langsdorff ordered the ship abandoned and radioed the British cruisers to pick up the crew. However, the crew declined, and perhaps thinking about his reception in Montevideo, Langsdorff decided to just leave the ship alone. The next excitement happened at 3:30 in the afternoon, and the confusing running away of Graf Spee was explained by the sighting by Achilles of a Hipper-class cruiser. An excellent trap had been sprung. It took a few minutes before Achilles signaled false alarm. The problem was that nobody had as yet sent any of the photos of the new German cruiser down to the Falklands, and the radio description rather matched the streamlined shape seen in the distance. This turned out to be another merchantman, Delane, which was a far more streamlined shape than most merchantmen of the time. Outside of 2 or 3 more salvos sent each way on general principle, that was it until Graf Spee pulled into Montevideo at night, much to the relief of the British prisoners. The British naval attaché in the area, Captain Henry McCall, flew into Montevideo to do the landside work of figuring out what was going on. Together with his intelligence officer, Captain Rex Miller, come daybreak, they simply borrowed a small boat and sailed up to the cruiser to have a gander. They couldn't see very much obviously wrong, and concluded that either something significant had happened internally to, say, the gunnery systems, or maybe the ship had just run out of ammunition. They decided that the best course of action was to send a note to the Uruguayan authorities, with whom they had a very good friendly relationship, to allow the German ship the minimum 24 hours required under international law, and then expel them from the port, which they did. In the meantime, the mission attempted to reach Commodore Harwood to find out what was going on from their end. Unfortunately, due to the lack of clandestine radio equipment, any signals had to be routed commercially via the Falkland Islands and then back to the ships. It took a while to get messages to and fro. The next morning, the information came back from Harwood that actually, as far as he knew, Graf Spee was quite functional, and he would be rather pleased if instead of seeing the ship forced out of harbor, McCall would do all that he could to see the ship kept there, at least until reinforcements with proper-sized guns showed up. Which, by the way, would be at least 4 more days. The immediate solution was to send out a merchant ship, SS Ashworth, which was in Montevideo at the time. She was instructed to get underway that evening. Nobody cared where, as long as she left harbor. The reason is that under international law, neutral power could not let a belligerent ship leave within 24 hours of a ship of the other competent side. So Uruguay accepted the note, posted 5 naval personnel under a petty officer on a small tug near the cruiser to keep her detained. The petty officer had a pistol. So there things sat, the Germans making repairs and burying their dead. The British prisoners were released, and they provided the first knowledge to the Royal Navy of Altmark and her cargo of prisoners. On the 16th, McCall borrowed another small boat and floated out to the 3-mile limit to meet Harwood aboard Ajax. At this point, the 2 Leanders had been joined by HMS Cumberland, a county-class cruiser with 2 more 8-inch guns than Exeter had. Ajax was still down half of its main battery, though. Discussion concluded that Graf Spee really needed to be kept in port, as Renown and Ark Royal were still 1,000 miles away in Rio and refueling, despite the BBC's pronouncements that they were substantially closer. The BBC announcements also rather confused Berlin, since they had believed that Ark Royal had been sunk in the North Sea. Accordingly, Langsdorff received a message saying that by order of the Führer, get a photo of Ark Royal if possible. Thus, merchant ship number 2 was instructed to leave, Dunster Grange. However, although this was accepted by the Uruguayan authorities as well, the British were told that they could accept no more notifications of departure because the Germans had themselves already reserved a departure spot for the next day. This was considered to be a bit of a problem, as the British forces would still not have made it to Montevideo. Miller hit upon a cunning plan, and with shades of Midway a couple of years later, relied on the fact that the British believed that the Germans had tapped into their communications. There was local precedent for this subterfuge because Graf Spee, the admiral, was lured to the Falklands in World War I by a fake signal transmitted on the German channels that the port was empty. This plan required spending more money than he had in his pocket though, so permission was necessary from London, which he obtained in about 4 hours through whatever non-admiralty mechanisms the intelligence officers seemed to have access to. McCall called his ambassador in Buenos Aires, and the general gist of the conversation was as follows. Sir, I need you to do something, and I don't have time to encode this. This is an unsecure line, Captain. Yeah, I know, but I don't have time. Look, I need for you to arrange for 2,000 tons of fuel oil to be ready tomorrow morning at the naval base at Mar del Plata with mooring for 2 capital ships. It was kind of mental click go off. Whoa, say that again, please. Slowly and clearly. You can probably figure things out from there. But just in case the Germans didn't get the message, the ambassador also leaked to the newspapers, which duly observed the Argentinians preparing the fuel which had been bought and paid for. The afternoon of Sunday the 17th of December, that lovely summer's day, saw throngs of people lining up for the final battle expected to happen just as soon as Graf Spee crossed the 3-mile limit. In the early afternoon, though, reports started coming in of crewmen disembarking from the ship. Awnings had been set up so it was difficult to see exactly, but a fortuitously positioned observer could count personnel off shipping and then transferring to the German merchantman Takema. By late afternoon, though, any pretenses of secrecy had been abandoned and some 800 crew were counted off. Obviously, she was not prepared to fight. At 6:15, with battle flags flying, she set off and with the help of 2 German tugs from a German-owned company in Buenos Aires, went past the breakwaters, followed by Takema, presumably to Argentina on the other side of the bay. But then she stopped about 3 miles out. Boat activity between her and Takema. At this point, folks began to figure out what was going on. And what was going on was the end of Graf Spee. The seacocks had been opened to start the sinking, but the major damage was going to be by explosion. The Germans had suspended torpedo heads by a rope over the main magazines. They poured lots of petrol over anything flammable, and also threw it into the magazine and on the surrounding decks. The last men off the ship lit the petrol, starting the fires. The fires got to the ropes, and when the rope burned away, the torpedo warhead fell into the magazine, resulting in a rather loud bang. Ironically, the blast wave brought about when the forward magazine blew put out the fires over the aft magazine, so that warhead never fell. The ship burned for 4 days. The wreck was purchased from Uruguay for about $14,000 by the British in a shell company, not directly, and investigations confirmed that the Germans were using a radar. The wreck remained in place in 10 meters of water, partially broken up by the British investigations until the turn of the century, when Uruguay decided it was a hazard to shipping and went after it again. Various parts, such as the anchor and rangefinder, are now on display in Montevideo. And that basically was that. So, what happened to everyone and everything else that was involved? Captain McCall was given the cruiser HMS Dido and later the battleship HMS Howe. Eventually became Flag Officer Destroyers Mediterranean after the war, and then Vice Admiral commanding Reserve Fleet. He retired in 1955, died 1980. Commodore Harwood immediately made Rear Admiral. He took Ajax back to the Falklands, made necessary repairs, and then returned to Montevideo for a heck of a party. Given the posting in South America, he had instructed his officers to all learn Spanish, and so they were well received. He was then sent to stew up in the Admiralty for a couple of years as the Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff, before receiving another star and becoming Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean in 1942. In 1944, he was sent to Scapa Flow and medically retired in August 45. Died 1950. His flagship, Ajax, was out of action, refitting in the UK until August of 1940 when she was sent to the Med. She took a bomb in Bonn, Algeria, in January 1943 and was sent to Norfolk, Virginia for repair. She supported Gold Beach at D-Day and then back to the Med to support the landings in the south of France. She survived the war and was used to transfer German internees from South America to Germany. These internees were, oddly enough, from Graf Spee's crew. She was broken up in 1948. The town of Ajax, Ontario is named after her. So if you're in Ajax and you see a street sign with a ship's silhouette on the sign, that street is named for a crewman of HMS Ajax. Achilles, which already had a predominantly New Zealand crew, was absorbed into the Royal New Zealand Navy as HMNZS Achilles in 1941. She saw out the rest of the war in the Pacific. A bomb took out her X turret, and seeing it replaced with more AA guns. In 1948, she was transferred again to the Indian Navy, where she was known as Delhi. Scrapped in 1978, her Y turret is now a gate guard at Devonport Navy Base in New Zealand. Exeter did not survive the war. Sent to the Pacific, she partook in the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, where she was crippled and the task force forced to withdraw. The Japanese tracked her down again the next day. She took multiple hits, including 2 torpedoes. She lay in 200 feet of water, and somewhere between 2007 and 2016, the wreckage was illegally and ignominiously salvaged. The war was not over for Altmark either. Now aware of the ship and her cargo of British prisoners, she became an object of significant attention for the British, who were determined to intercept her before she made Germany. Altmark took the long way around, looping up north of the UK before coming back down through Norwegian coastal waters. The UK repeatedly asked the Norwegians to stop the ship, but the Norwegians, probably looking to avoid particularly antagonizing Germany, made only token investigation and reporting nothing amiss when they boarded. Things came to a head. The British knew where their men were and were not about to give the Germans a propaganda win. In what is believed to be the last hostile boarding action of the Royal Navy against an enemy ship, HMS Cossacks sailors boarded, engaged in a firefight, and then liberated the prisoners. Altmark was run up on the rocks. Cossack returned home with 229 freed prisoners. She was later sunk by U-boat 563 in 1941. U-563 was sunk by aircraft in 1943. Altmark herself was later recovered by the Germans, renamed Uckermark, and after a brief flirtation in North Atlantic in company of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in early 1941, she found her way to Yokohama to be the supply ship for the auxiliary cruiser Thor. While there in November 1942, she exploded, possibly due to a spark caused by a repairman combining with fuel fumes. 53 people died. Survivors were sent home aboard Doggerbank, but she was torpedoed by U-43 in the North Atlantic with the loss of all but one of the 365 men aboard. U-43 was sunk, with all hands, in July 1943 by a homing torpedo dropped by an Avenger from USS Santee. SS Ashworth was sunk by U-221 in 1942. U-221 was sunk in turn by Halifax in 1943. Dunster Grange was damaged in a gun battle with U-37 in May 1940 but survived the war. U-37 also survived the war, only to be scuttled upon a German surrender in May 1945. Finally, what of Captain Langsdorff? He was responsible for not a single death of a British merchant sailor as he sank 9 ships. The instructions from Berlin had been, attempt by all means to extend the time in neutral waters. Fight your way through to Buenos Aires if possible. No internment in Uruguay. Attempt effective destruction of ship if scuttled. Langsdorff, in his message to Berlin, believed that escape into the open sea and then a breakthrough to home waters was hopeless, and believed that his choice was between internment and scuttling. On 20th of December 1939, Langsdorff wrote a letter to the German minister. After a long struggle, I reached the grave decision to scuttle the ship, Admiral Graf Spee, in order to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. I am still convinced that under the circumstances, the decision was the only one left once I had taken my ship into the trap of Montevideo. For with the ammunition remaining, any attempt to fight my way back to the open and deep water was bound to fail. And yet only in deep water could I have scuttled the ship after having used the remaining ammunition, thus avoiding her falling to the enemy. Sooner than expose my ship to the danger that after a brave fight she would fall partly or completely into enemy hands, I decided not to fight, but to destroy the equipment and then scuttle the ship. It was clear to me that this decision might be consciously or unwittingly misconstrued by persons ignorant of my motives as being attributable entirely or partly to personal consideration. Therefore, I decided from the beginning to bear the consequences involved in this decision. For a captain with a sense of honor, it goes without saying that the personal fate cannot be separated from that of his ship. I postponed my intention as long as I still bore responsibility for decisions concerning the welfare of my crew under my command. After today's decision of the Argentine government, I can do no more for my ship's company. There's a little bit more to the letter, but that's the general gist of it. After signing it, he lay down on the ship's ensign and then shot himself. So there you have it, the last cruise of Admiral Graf Spee. We'll probably go back to tanks, I think, for the next talk, but I hope you found this one a little bit interesting as well. Nicholas Moore, the Chieftain, and we'll see you on the next one.